"You're going to make us birth sons." That's what 3 lonely widows declared to a virgin mountain man in the middle of a dusty frontier street. The church bell tolled, townsfolk gasped, and the quiet man, who had never even held a woman's hand, stood frozen as their words echoed through the valley. But this wasn't a scandal. It was a plea. These women had lost everything, husbands, sons, even hope, and they were staking their future on the one man too shy to even meet their eyes. Just as the strange household begins to find warmth, iron wheels of the railroad thunder closer. Smoke in the night. Keys turning in a jail cell, a powerful agent claiming their spring, and the only man who can defend them dragged off in chains. Now, with winter pressing in and the law against them, these widows must uncover secrets buried in old treaties, call on allies once forgotten, and fight for the family they've begun to build. Will a man who has never known love find the courage to stand? And can 3 widows save him before everything is lost? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The autumn wind whistled through Pine Hollow's main street as Elijah Harper stood frozen, his hand still gripping the weathered door of the county office. The deed to his father's 20 acres felt heavy in his coat pocket, but the weight of 3 pairs of eyes upon him felt heavier still. Ruth Dawson, the eldest of the widows, stepped forward. Her stern face bore the lines of hard years, but her voice carried the strength of mountain oak. "Mr. Harper," she said, each word measured and clear, "we've given this careful thought and prayer." Elijah's throat went dry. He'd known these women from church, back when his father still made him attend. Clara Whitlow, whose sharp tongue was known to cut deeper than any knife, stood with her arms crossed. Beside her, young Naomi Clark clutched her black shawl tight, her eyes still carrying the shadow of recent grief. "I dot," Elijah started, but the words stuck like molasses in winter. Clara's voice carried across the street, making him wince. "You've got land. We've got skills. None of us will survive winter alone." The townsfolk had stopped their usual bustle. Mrs. Peterson paused in sweeping her store's porch. The smithy's hammer fell silent. Even the telegraph operator peered through his window, spectacles glinting in the morning sun. "Make you birth sons?" Elijah finally managed to sputter, his face burning redder than the maple leaves scattered across the street. "We need a man's name for protection," Ruth explained, her tone softening just slightly. "And you need help running that land. Your father knew that much." The mention of his father made Elijah's chest tighten. Since the old man's passing 3 months ago, the line shack had grown quieter than he'd ever thought possible. The endless tasks of maintaining the land alone had left his hands raw and his spirits low. Naomi spoke then, her voice gentle as spring rain. "We know you're a good man, Mr. Harper. Your father spoke well of you at church, said you had his sense of duty." More onlookers gathered. Someone whispered, "Virgin hermit," and nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Elijah's shoulders hunched instinctively, making his tall frame seem smaller. "This ain't proper," he muttered, though his words lacked conviction. "Proper?" Clara's laugh held more bark than humor. "Proper won't keep us fed when snow's 6 feet deep. Proper won't protect us from claim jumpers or wolves." Ruth stepped closer, her Bible-calloused hands folded before her. "The good book speaks of Ruth and Naomi finding shelter with Boaz. Sometimes the Lord's path ain't what we expect, but He provides." Elijah's eyes darted between the 3 women, then to the watching crowd. His father had taught him that a man's word was his bond, that helping those in need wasn't charity but duty. But this? This was more than helping a neighbor mend fences or sharing spring water rights. I need time to think," he managed, backing away from their steady gazes. "Sunset's early these days," Clara reminded him sharply. "We'll need to know before dark." Elijah nodded jerkily, then all but fled down the street, his long legs carrying him swiftly past the curious stares and whispered comments. His horse nickered a greeting as he untied it from the hitching post, and soon he was galloping out of town, the sound of hoofbeats drowning out the lingering echoes of the widow's words. The ride home gave him time to think, but his thoughts spun like leaves in a whirlwind. The line shack came into view as the sun began its westward slide. It stood alone against the autumn-painted hills, smoke from the morning's fire long since dispersed. Inside, Elijah lit the lamp and sank into his father's old chair. The cabin felt hollow, marked by absences. His mother's rocker stood empty in the corner. His father's pipe lay cold on the mantel. Even the shadows seemed longer, deeper. He thought of the widows' faces, Ruth's quiet strength, Clara's fierce determination, young Naomi's lingering sorrow. He knew their stories. Clara's husband crushed in a cattle stampede, Ruth's family taken by fever, Naomi's man lost to a mining accident while she carried their child, a babe that hadn't lived to see spring. The lamp's flame flickered as evening crept in. Elijah's gaze fell on his father's Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. He could almost hear the old man's voice. "Son, the good Lord doesn't always speak in thunder. Sometimes his call comes in the quiet moments, in the needs of others." The cabin's silence pressed in around him. He thought of the coming winter, of long nights with only his thoughts for company. He thought of his father's last words about legacy, about building something that would last. Elijah stood, his decision settling into place like a foundation stone. The widows were right. None of them could face the frontier alone. Perhaps that was why the Lord had brought them together on this day, under the watching eyes of Pine Hollow. He stepped outside as the first stars appeared. The autumn air had grown sharp with the promise of frost, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the gathering night. Elijah Harper looked toward town, knowing his life would never be the same after tomorrow. As darkness claimed the valley, he whispered a prayer, not for guidance anymore, but for strength. The path ahead was clear, even if it wasn't the one he'd expected to walk. His father had always said that the measure of a man wasn't in his words but in his actions. Tomorrow would test that measure, and Elijah intended to stand tall. Dawn painted the eastern sky in gentle pinks and golds as Elijah Harper guided his horse down the trail toward Pine Hollow. His breath fogged in the crisp morning air, and frost crackled beneath his mount's hooves. The decision he'd made in the night felt both terrifying and right, like standing on the edge of a cliff with solid ground beneath him. The mercantile's weathered facade came into view as he rounded the last bend. There they stood, three black-clad figures huddled against the morning chill, their shawls pulled tight. A small pile of trunks and crates waited beside them, along with a coop of nervous chickens. Ruth Dawson spotted him first, her stern face softening slightly. "We knew you'd come," she said simply, as if she'd read the answer in the stars. Clara Whitlow stood with her arms crossed, studying him with sharp eyes. "Took your time about it," she remarked, but there was less bite in her tone than yesterday. Young Naomi Clark just nodded, her delicate features pinched with cold. Dark circles beneath her eyes suggested a sleepless night. Elijah dismounted, his boots raising small clouds of dust. I ain't got much," he began awkwardly. "The cabin's small, rough, but there's a good roof and a warm hearth." "Better than sleeping in Widow Thompson's barn," Clara said flatly, "which is where we'd be if you'd said no." Ruth stepped forward, practical as always. "Mr. Peterson's lending us his wagon for the day. We'll need help loading our things." Elijah nodded, grateful for something to do with his hands. The next hour passed in quiet industry as they carefully arranged trunks and boxes. The chicken coop required special attention, with Naomi softly reassuring her nervous hens. The sun had climbed above the buildings when they finally set out. Elijah led on horseback, while Ruth took the wagon's reins. Clara and Naomi sat in the back, wedged between their possessions. The wagon's wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they left town behind. The rocky trail wound upward through stands of pine and aspen. Autumn had painted the leaves in brilliant golds, but the beauty felt hollow against the gravity of their situation. They passed the morning in scattered conversation, words rising and falling like leaves in the wind. "My Thomas always said these hills had good grazing," Clara mentioned, as they passed a meadow. Her voice caught slightly on her husband's name. "Before the stampede took him." "The grass is sweet here," Elijah agreed quietly. "My father used to say the same." Naomi spoke up from her perch among the trunks. "I remember when my James and I first came through these parts. Everything looked so wild and beautiful." She traced her fingers over her black shawl. "The mining accident, it was just 3 months after." Ruth clicked to the horses, her voice steady. "The Lord gives and takes away, but He also provides new paths when old ones close." They stopped at midday to rest the horses and share a simple meal of bread and dried apple. The October sun offered little warmth, and they huddled close to drink coffee from tin cups. "How far yet?" Clara asked, stamping her feet against the cold. "Another 4 hours, maybe 5, Elijah answered. "The trail gets rougher ahead." He wasn't wrong. The afternoon brought steeper climbs and looser rock. The wagon wheel slipped more than once, requiring all hands to push through difficult stretches. But the women worked without complaint, their determination evident in every strain and grunt. The sun was settling toward the western peaks when they finally crested the last rise. Elijah's cabin sat in a small clearing, smoke still curling from the morning's fire. It was a humble sight, logs gone silver with age, the roof slightly bowed in the middle, a lean-to shed listing to one side. "It ain't much," Elijah said quickly, heat rising to his face. "I mean to fix it up proper, but—" "We've known worse roofs," Clara cut him off, already climbing down from the wagon. Her practical eyes were assessing the structure, likely cataloging every repair needed. They unloaded quickly, eager to be settled before full dark. The cabin's single room felt cramped with 4 people moving about, but they managed a careful dance of unpacking essentials. Naomi settled her chickens in the lean-to, while Ruth organized their food stores with quiet efficiency. Clara took charge of supper, finding Elijah's meager pantry and somehow conjuring a meal of beans and cornbread. The rough-hewn table that had known only solitary meals now held 4 plates, 4 cups, 4 sets of utensils. The change felt enormous. As they ate by lamplight, Elijah watched his unexpected household. Ruth's steady presence seemed to anchor them all. Clara's sharp edges had softened slightly, revealing glimpses of the capable woman beneath. And Naomi, though quiet, had stopped looking quite so lost. After the dishes were washed and dried, the women laid out straw pallets near the hearth. Elijah retreated to his narrow bed in the corner, suddenly aware of every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of movement. In the darkness, he heard their quiet conversations. "At least the roof doesn't leak," Clara murmured. "And the walls are solid," Naomi added softly. "No wind getting through." "First time in months I felt proper walls around me," Ruth's voice carried quiet satisfaction. "The Lord does provide." Elijah lay awake, staring at the familiar shadows on his ceiling. They looked different now, somehow less lonely. He offered up a silent prayer, part gratitude and part plea for guidance. Had he made a terrible mistake? Or had the Lord truly sent these women to his door? The cabin settled into night sounds, the pop of cooling embers, the whisper of wind in the eaves, and the soft breathing of 3 women who had placed their trust in him. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight they all had shelter. Perhaps that was enough to build on. Morning came early to the mountain cabin. Elijah woke to unfamiliar sounds, the rustle of skirts, quiet footsteps, the gentle clinking of cookware. For a moment he lay still, remembering yesterday's momentous change. The cabin that had known only silence now held 4 souls. Clara was already outside, her boots crunching on frost as she hauled water from the creek. The wooden bucket creaked against the rope, a sound that had always meant solitude to Elijah but now carried new purpose. Ruth moved with quiet efficiency, heading to the lean-to where Naomi's chickens had spent their first night. Inside, Naomi swept the plank floor with steady strokes, humming softly to herself. Elijah rose, feeling awkward in his own home. He'd never had to consider others in his morning routine. Now every movement seemed to require careful thought. Should he wait for the women to finish at the wash basin? Was it proper to put on his boots while they were present? Ruth returned with fresh eggs, her practical manner cutting through his uncertainty. "Come to table, Mr. Harper. The Lord's bounty waits for no man's shyness." They gathered around the rough-hewn table, steam rising from bowls of cornmeal mush. Elijah cleared his throat, attempting the blessing as he always had. "Lord, thanks for this food." "If I may," Ruth interrupted gently. Her voice carried the weight of Scripture as she continued. "The eyes of all look to you, and you give them their food at the proper time. You open your hand and satisfy the desires of every living thing." Psalm 145, verses 15 and 16. She paused, adding, "Amen." "Amen," the others echoed. Elijah felt his face warm but nodded gratefully. His father had taught him faith, but Ruth's deeper knowledge offered welcome guidance. The day unfolded in a flurry of activity. The women moved with purpose, each finding ways to reshape the crude cabin into something more habitable. Clara, after finishing the water hauling, turned her attention to the drafty windows. Her capable hands worked steadily, using scraps of cloth to stuff the worst gaps. Naomi continued her sweeping, then began unpacking their meager possessions. Faded quilts appeared, their worn patterns still beautiful. These she hung on the rough walls, bringing color and warmth to the bare logs. As she worked, she hummed a gentle tune, a lullaby that seemed to catch in her throat occasionally. During one such pause, Elijah glimpsed tears in her eyes and remembered the child she'd lost. The melody carried grief like autumn carries fallen leaves. Ruth organized their food stores with military precision, tisking at the state of Elijah's supplies. Soon, the scent of baking bread filled the cabin, a smell Elijah hadn't experienced since his father's passing. The yeasty warmth seemed to soften the cabin's hard edges. Elijah himself tackled the loose roof beam that had worried him all summer. The constant creak had been bearable when he slept alone, but now it needed fixing. He worked steadily, aware of movement below as the women transformed his bachelor dwelling. Naomi's lullaby drifted up through the rafters, making his hammer pause mid-swing more than once. By late afternoon, the cabin had shifted. Quilts softened the walls, the windows stood less drafty, and the roof beams sat solid and silent. The air held the mingled scents of fresh bread and bubbling stew. Clara's doing, with vegetables from their combined stores. They gathered again for supper, the room warmer than Elijah could remember. Lamplight caught the quilt's colors, and the fire crackled cheerfully. Even the rough table seemed less crude, set with Ruth's carefully preserved tablecloth. The peaceful moment shattered at the sound of horses outside. Rough laughter carried through the walls, along with crude comments about Harper's wives and suggestions about his intentions. Elijah's face burned with shame and anger, but before he could rise, Clara's hand shot out. "Let them talk," she said firmly. "Empty heads make the most noise." Ruth nodded, her expression stern but calm. "Their words have no power unless we give it to them." Naomi said nothing, but her hands steadied as she continued eating, showing more strength than her gentle appearance suggested. The riders eventually moved on, their laughter fading into the gathering dark. Inside, the four sat in companionable silence until Ruth spoke, her voice soft but certain. "We aren't here for scandal," she declared, meeting each person's eyes in turn. "We're here to build something that lasts." Elijah felt his face warm again, but this time with something closer to pride. He nodded, unable to find words, but understanding the truth in hers. This strange arrangement might raise eyebrows, but its foundation felt solid as the mountain itself. The wind picked up as night fell properly, howling around the cabin's corners like a hungry wolf. But inside, the fire burned steady. The quilts caught its light and held it. The patched windows kept out the worst drafts, and fresh bread sat wrapped in clean cloth. 4 people who had been alone yesterday found themselves together, wrapped in unexpected peace. Ruth read from her Bible by lamplight, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the wind. Clara darned socks with precise stitches, while Naomi worked on another quilt patch. Elijah whittled quietly in his corner, watching his. Solitary home becomes something new, something that felt increasingly like salvation for all of them. When time came for sleep, they moved in the now familiar pattern. Women to their pallets, Elijah to his corner bed. The wind continued its wild song outside, but within the cabin's walls, hope had taken root like a tender seedling pushing through mountain soil. A week passed like water flowing over smooth stones. The mountain air grew crisper as autumn settled deeper into the land. Elijah and Clara set out at dawn to move the sheep to higher pasture, where patches of sweet grass still grew between rocky outcrops. Clara rode with the ease of someone born to the saddle, her dark widow's shawl replaced by a practical work coat. She whistled commands to her border collie, who darted around the flock with practiced skill. Elijah watched her work, admiring how she seemed to read the sheep's minds before they even thought to stray. "You handle them well," he said, his voice barely carrying over the bells jangling from the sheep's necks. Clara's mouth quirked into a half-smile. "Had my own flock before." She didn't finish, but Elijah understood. Before the stampede that took her husband. Before everything changed. They guided the sheep up narrow trails, past the spring that fed Elijah's land. Clear water bubbled from the ground there, steady and sweet as it had been since his father's time. The sheep paused to drink, their wool catching the morning light. "Fine water," Clara noted, dismounting to fill her canteen. "Your father chose well when he settled here." Elijah nodded, pride warming his chest. The spring had never failed, even in the driest summers. It was the heart of the property, making everything else possible. The higher pasture welcomed them with waving grass and scattered wildflowers holding out against the coming frost. They settled the sheep, Clara's dog keeping watch while they ate a simple lunch of bread and dried beef. The return trip was easier, their horses picking their way down familiar trails. But as they approached the cabin, Elijah spotted an unfamiliar horse tied out front, a sleek bay stallion with fancy tack that screamed city money. A well-dressed man stood near the spring, examining it with proprietary interest. His suit was Eastern cut, his boots polished to a shine that had no business on mountain trails. When he heard their approach, he turned with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, Mr. Harper, I presume?" The man's voice carried the smooth confidence of someone used to getting his way. "I'm Theodore Wellington, representing the Western Pacific Railroad Company." He pulled documents from his leather satchel, holding them out like weapons. "I'm here about this spring of yours." Elijah dismounted slowly, his stomach knotting. Clara remained on her horse, watching with narrow eyes. "What about my spring?" Elijah asked, hating how his voice wavered. Wellington's smile widened. "According to these documents, the water rights belong to the railroad, critical for our upcoming line through the valley." He gestured expansively. "Progress marches on, Mr. Harper. The railroad needs water for its steam engines." "But," Elijah's throat felt dry. "My father's deed." "Oh yes, your little homestead claim." Wellington's tone dripped condescension. "Filed by an uneducated mountain man who probably couldn't even read the fine print, water rights were specifically excluded." He glanced at Clara, then back to Elijah with a smirk. "Though I see you've found interesting ways to make use of the property." Clara's voice cut like a whip. "Mind your implications, Mr. Wellington. We're God-fearing folk here." Of course." Wellington tucked the papers away. "But God-fearing or not, eviction is coming. The railroad's rights supersede any arrangement you've made here." He mounted his horse with theatrical grace. "Expect official notice within the month. Good day." They watched him ride away, dust rising behind his horse's hooves. Clara spat in his tracks. "Snake in fancy boots," she muttered. Inside the cabin, tension crackled like static before a storm. Ruth stood at the stove, stirring soup with sharp movements that betrayed her anger. Naomi sat in the corner, tears sliding silently down her cheeks as she worked on mending. Clara paced like a caged mountain lion. "We can't let them take it," Clara declared, her voice hard. "That spring's the lifeblood of this place. Without it, we might as well scatter to the winds." "The railroad has armies of lawyers," Ruth said, though her tone suggested she agreed with Clara's sentiment, "and deeper pockets than we could dream of." Naomi's quiet voice trembled. "I can't lose another home. I just can't." Her hands twisted in her apron. "First my Thomas, then our baby, now this?" "God's justice doesn't bow to railroad money," Ruth reminded them, setting down her spoon to place a gentle hand on Naomi's shoulder. "We must trust in his plan." Elijah stood by the window, watching darkness gather outside. His father's words echoed in his memory. "Land's only worth something if you're willing to fight for it." But what did he know about fighting? He was just a mountain hermit, like Wellington said. These women depended on him, and he felt the weight of that trust like lead in his stomach. He barely slept that night, listening to the spring's steady gurgle mixing with the soft breathing of his unlikely household. The water had sung him to sleep every night of his life. How could he let them take it? Dawn found him kneeling by the spring, watching the first light touch its clear surface. The water emerged from the earth with quiet confidence, as it had for countless years before any railroad man drew a line on a map. "I won't let them have you," he whispered, his voice stronger than it had been yesterday. "This land was my father's dream, and now it's home to folks who need it." He dipped his hand in the cool water. "God help me, I'll find a way to defend it." The sun rose fully, painting the mountain in gold. Behind him, smoke rose from the cabin's chimney as Ruth started breakfast. Clara's dog barked at something in the distance. Naomi's voice lifted in a hymn as she gathered eggs. Elijah stood, water dripping from his fingers. He might not know much about fighting railroads, but he knew about keeping promises. This one, whispered to the spring at dawn, he intended to keep. The next morning, Elijah saddled his horse before dawn. The autumn air bit sharp and clean as he guided his mount down the mountain trail toward Pine Hollow. His father's old pocket watch marked 7 o'clock when he reached the county office, its weathered sign creaking in the morning breeze. Inside, coal smoke from the potbelly stove mixed with the musty scent of old papers. The county clerk, Mr. Peterson, sat hunched over his desk, round spectacles slipping down his nose as he scratched at ledgers with his pen. "Morning, Mr. Peterson," Elijah said, removing his hat. "I need some advice about water rights." The clerk looked up, recognition slowly dawning. "Ah, young Harper, your father's boy." He gestured to a wooden chair. "What seems to be the trouble?" Elijah settled into the chair, which creaked under his weight. "Railroad man came yesterday. Says they own my spring." His hands twisted his hat brim. "But that spring's been ours since father homesteaded. Got papers to prove it." Peterson sighed, setting down his pen. "Railroad's been buying up water rights all through the territory. Got more lawyers than we got cattle." He shuffled through some papers, though Elijah suspected it was more habit than purpose. "Truth is, son, railroad money runs this town now. Judge Morton over in Carson City won't even hear cases against them anymore." "But it ain't right," Elijah protested, his voice stronger than usual. "That spring feeds 4 households now." The clerk's eyebrows rose. "4? Heard talk about those widows moving up to your place?" He shook his head. "Unusual arrangement, if you don't mind my saying." "They needed help," Elijah said simply. "And now I need help too." Peterson's expression softened with sympathy, but he just shrugged. Wish I could offer more hope, son, but when railroad money talks, most folks just listen. Dejected, but not defeated, Elijah left the county office. His boots echoed on the wooden sidewalk as he walked toward Pine Hollow's small church. The white clapboard building stood plain but proud against the morning sky, its steeple pointing heavenward like an accusing finger. He found Pastor Amos Whitfield in the church garden, tending to late-blooming marigolds. The older man's kind face crinkled with welcome as Elijah approached. "Brother Harper," the pastor greeted him, brushing dirt from his hands. "You look troubled." Elijah poured out the whole story: the railroad man's visit, the threat of eviction, the clerk's discouraging words. Pastor Amos listened quietly, nodding at times, his weathered face thoughtful. When Elijah finished, the pastor picked up his watering can and tended to the flowers as he spoke. "You know the story of David and Goliath?" "Yes, sir. Little shepherd boy against a giant." "Indeed," Pastor Amos smiled. "1 Corinthians tells us God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong, the foolish things to shame the wise." He set down the watering can and faced Elijah directly. "The world may see a mountain hermit and 3 widows, but God might see exactly the people he needs for his purpose. But what can we do against railroad lawyers?" "Truth has its own power, son, and you're not alone anymore." The pastor's eyes twinkled. "Those women he sent you, they're strong in ways that matter. Ruth knows her scripture better than most preachers. Clara's got fire in her bones. And Naomi?" He chuckled. "That girl's prayers could move mountains." Elijah felt something warm kindle in his chest. Not quite confidence, but maybe it's beginning. "Thank you, Pastor." "I'll be riding up for Sunday service soon," Pastor Amos called, as Elijah mounted his horse. "We'll talk more then." The ride home took on a different character, hope lifting Elijah's spirits despite the challenges ahead. As he approached the cabin, signs of change caught his eye. Clara worked along the fence line, her sure hands replacing rotted posts. The new wood stood straight and proud against the mountain backdrop. In the small kitchen garden, Naomi knelt in the dirt, tucking turnip seedlings into neat rows. Her quiet humming carried on the breeze. Though the growing season was late, her faith in next season's harvest showed in every careful placement. Inside, Ruth sat at the table with their single lamp, reading aloud from her well-worn Bible. Her strong voice shaped the ancient words with clarity and conviction. She looked up as Elijah entered, marking her place with a faded ribbon. "How went your inquiries?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "County clerk says the railroad owns this town," Elijah admitted, sinking into a chair. "But Pastor Amos says God often uses the weak to shame the strong." Ruth nodded approvingly. "Pastor's a wise man." By supper time, all 4 gathered around the table. Steam rose from bowls of bean soup, and fresh-baked cornbread filled the cabin with its homey scent. Elijah cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "I mean to. Fight this claim," he announced, though he couldn't quite keep the tremor from his voice. "Don't rightly know how yet, but that spring's ours by right and need." The women exchanged looks that spoke volumes. Clara's jaw set in determination. Ruth's eyes sparked with approval, and Naomi's gentle face showed unexpected steel beneath its softness. Without a word, Clara reached across the table and placed her work-roughened hand over Elijah's. Ruth's strong fingers joined them, and finally Naomi's smaller hand completed the circle. "We stand together," Ruth declared, her voice firm as a mountain granite. "This land's not just yours anymore, it's ours, all of ours." "The Lord is our shepherd," Naomi added softly. "We shall not want." Clara's grip tightened. "And if those railroad men want to fight, they'll find we ain't as weak as they reckon." Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, their wild voices echoing off the mountainsides. But inside the cabin, lamplight gleamed on determined faces and clasped hands. The simple room glowed with something stronger than its single flame, the light of 4 hearts united in purpose, 4 souls bound together by need and choice and faith. Elijah looked at their joined hands on the rough wooden table. His father had always said a man's word was his bond. Now, in the warm light of this unexpected family, he felt the truth of another kind of bond, one forged by shared struggle and mutual trust. The evening prayer, when it came, rose from 4 voices instead of 1, carrying into the gathering dark like a challenge and a promise combined. The mountain autumn painted the landscape in bold strokes of red and gold. Days flowed into weeks as the unlikely household found its rhythm. Each sunrise brought new signs of life to the once lonely homestead, transforming it like the changing leaves. In the cramped kitchen, Naomi stood at the rough wooden table, flour dusting her arms as she kneaded bread dough. The familiar motions seemed to lift years of grief from her shoulders. Her humming, once hesitant, now filled the cabin with snippets of hymns learned in happier times. "Smells like heaven itself," Clara remarked, pausing in the doorway. Her arms cradled worn leather pieces from Elijah's old saddle. Naomi's laugh, clear and unexpected, rang out like birdsong. "It's just sourdough, Clara, though I reckon the good Lord wouldn't turn his nose up at it." The sound of her laughter drew Ruth from her mending by the window. She smiled, needle pausing mid-stitch. "First time I've heard that sweet sound in months," she said softly. Naomi blushed, but didn't stop kneading. "Feels right somehow, like my hands remember what my heart forgot for a while." Outside, Clara led Elijah to the barn, where afternoon light streamed through cracks in the wooden walls. She spread the saddle pieces on a workbench, hands moving with practiced ease. "Watch close now," she instructed, threading a heavy needle. "Saddle's like a marriage, needs attention and care to last." Her capable fingers worked the leather with sure strokes. "See how the stitches need to be even? Too loose, they'll pull apart. Too tight, they'll tear through." Elijah's larger hands fumbled with the needle, but Clara showed patience born of teaching her own sons, now lost to fever. "There you go," she encouraged, as his stitches grew steadier. "You've got a gentle touch for such big hands." Evenings brought their own peace. Ruth's voice carried the ancient words of Psalms through the cabin, strength and comfort woven through each verse. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read, lamplight catching the silver in her dark hair. "I shall not want." The others listened, tasks slowing. Naomi's fingers stilled on her mending, Clara's boot-tapping ceased, and Elijah's whittling paused as the familiar words wrapped around them like a warm shawl. When Saturday dawned clear and crisp, they prepared for the ride to town. The women wore their best dresses, faded but clean, with shawls against the morning chill. Elijah had scrubbed his hands until the sheep grease was gone and donned his father's old Sunday coat. The wagon rattled down the mountain trail, past stands of aspen trembling gold in the autumn light. As they approached Pine Hollow, the church bell tolled across the valley, calling the faithful to worship. Townsfolk gathered on the church steps, conversation dying as Elijah helped the widows down from the wagon. Whispers followed them like autumn leaves. Shameless, that's what it is. Living together, unmarried. That Harper boy, taking advantage. Clara's spine stiffened, and Ruth's chin lifted, but it was Naomi who surprised them all by reaching for Elijah's arm with quiet dignity. They walked together into the whitewashed church, heads high. Pastor Amos stood at the pulpit, his kind eyes taking in the congregation. When he raised his hands for the opening prayer, his voice rang with authority that silenced the whispers. "Lord," he prayed, "we thank you for your mysterious ways, for how you stitch together broken hearts into new families. Today we especially lift up the household of Elijah Harper and the widows Ruth, Clara, and Naomi, bound together not by blood, but by your divine provision." A murmur rippled through the pews, but the pastor continued undaunted. "You tell us, Lord, that you set the lonely in families." We see your hand in this house stitched by God, where grief gives way to new purpose and solitude yields to shared strength." Elijah felt warmth spread through his chest, and he noticed Naomi dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Clara's usually stern face softened, while Ruth's quiet "Amen" carried the weight of Scripture itself. After the service, children played in the churchyard, their laughter carrying on the autumn breeze. Unlike their parents, they showed no fear of the unusual family. Little Sarah Miller offered Naomi a handful of late wildflowers, while the Cooper boys peppered Elijah with questions about his sheep. "Children know truth when they see it," Ruth observed quietly, watching Naomi arrange the flowers in her hair. The ride home held a different quality than the journey to town. The widows sat straighter, their faces peaceful despite the rough trail. Clara hummed a hymn, her strong voice carrying over the wagon's creaking. Naomi's fingers still touched the wildflowers in her hair, and Ruth's eyes held a distant, thoughtful look. When they reached the homestead, the setting sun painted the cabin in warm gold. While the women prepared a simple supper, Elijah walked to the edge of his property where the view opened up to the valley below. Stars were just beginning to appear in the deepening blue above, bright and countless as promises. He lowered himself onto a fallen log, letting the evening settle around him. From the cabin came the sounds of life, pots clinking, Clara's laugh at something Naomi said, Ruth's voice raised in an evening hymn. The sounds wrapped around him like a quilt, warm and familiar now, though they had been foreign just weeks ago. "Lord," he whispered to the emerging stars, "I never thought to be rich in family, being just a mountain man alone." His throat tightened with emotion. "These women you sent, they're more than I deserve. They've brought life back to this place, back to me." A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Elijah's hands, still bearing calluses from the morning's chores, clasped together in his lap. "I thank you," he continued softly, "for Pastor Amos's blessing, for the children's pure hearts, for every laugh that rings in that cabin now." He paused, the shadow of worry crossing his face. "But Lord, that railroad threat still looms. I don't know if I'm strong enough to protect what you've given me to protect." The stars continued their silent wheeling overhead, offering no immediate answer. But from the cabin came Ruth's voice, calling him to supper, and Elijah rose from his log. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was no longer facing them alone. The cabin window glowed with lamplight as he approached, a beacon of warmth in the gathering dusk. Inside, 4 plates waited on the rough table, 4 cups stood ready for evening tea, and 3 women who had become his family looked up with welcoming smiles. Elijah paused in the doorway, fixing this moment in his memory, the light, the warmth, the belonging. Whatever the railroad might bring, this gift of family was something no paper claim could take away. The autumn sun hung low on the horizon as Elijah's wagon rattled down the mountain trail from Pine Hollow's market. His pockets held barely enough coins from selling wool to buy winter supplies. Clara and Ruth had stayed behind to tend the sheep, while Naomi rode beside him now, carefully holding a precious sack of flour. "Looks like a storm coming," Naomi said softly, peering at dark clouds gathering in the west. But as they rounded the last bend toward home, Elijah's heart stopped. Black smoke rose from their valley like a devil's finger against the sky. "Dear Lord, no," he whispered, snapping the reins. The horses lurched forward, hooves thundering on the rocky path. Naomi clutched the wagon seat, her knuckles white. As they drew closer, the acrid smell of burning wood filled their lungs. Through the haze, Elijah could make out several men on horseback moving away from their property, their shapes dark against the setting sun. Railroad men. The wagon had barely stopped when Elijah leapt down, running toward the burning corral. Ruth and Clara were already there, throwing buckets of water on the flames. Sheep bleated in panic, some lying too still in the smoking grass. "The spring water!" Elijah shouted, grabbing empty buckets. "Form a line!" Naomi joined them, her dress hem dragging through ash as they passed buckets from hand to hand. Smoke burned their eyes and throats, but they worked without stopping. When the last flame died, the destruction became clear in the fading light. The corral lay in charred ruins. 5 sheep hadn't escaped the flames, good breeding stock that had cost Elijah's father dearly. Clara knelt beside one dead lamb, her weathered hands trembling as she stroked its scorched wool. "Who could do such a thing?" Naomi choked out between coughs, tears cutting clean trails through the soot on her face. Ruth's voice was hard as iron. "The railroad wants our spring. They mean to drive us out." Before Elijah could respond, hoofbeats approached. Sheriff Thomas Keene rode up with 2 deputies, their badges catching the last rays of sunlight. Instead of dismounting to help, they sat their horses like judges at a trial. "Elijah Harper," Keene called out, his voice carrying false authority. "I have here a warrant for your arrest." "Arrest?" Clara stepped forward, ash falling from her skirts. "These men just burned our corral. They killed our sheep." The sheriff pulled a paper from his vest. "Mr. Harper is charged with fraud and criminal trespass. The railroad company holds legal claim to this property, particularly the spring. He's been squatting illegally." "That's not true," Naomi cried. "This land belonged to his father." "The papers say different, ma'am." Keene nodded to his deputies. "Take him in." The deputies swung down from their horses, moving toward Elijah with iron manacles ready. He stood frozen, face streaked with soot, unable to believe this was happening. "You can't!" Ruth's voice cracked like summer lightning. "We need him here. The sheep. The winter coming." "Step aside, widow," Keene warned. "Don't make this worse." The deputies grabbed Elijah's arms. He didn't resist, couldn't risk bringing more trouble on the women. But as the cold iron closed around his wrists, Naomi's scream tore through the smoky air like a wounded animal's cry. "Please!" she begged, trying to reach him. "Please don't take him!" Clara held her back as the deputies led Elijah to a waiting horse. Ruth stood straight as a pine tree, her eyes burning with righteous anger. "The Lord sees this injustice, Sheriff Keene," she declared. "He sees and he remembers." The sheriff touched his hat brim, a mockery of courtesy. "Y'all best clear out soon. This ain't your land anymore." He turned his horse, and the small procession moved away into the gathering dark, taking Elijah with them. The women stood among the smoking ruins, watching until the riders disappeared. Then Naomi's legs gave way, and she sank to her knees in the ash. Clara's arms went around her shoulders, while Ruth's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What do we do now?" Naomi whispered. No one had an answer. They made their way back to the cabin as night fell, moving like sleepwalkers. The evening chores still needed doing, surviving sheep to tend, water to fetch, fire to build. They worked in silence, each lost in her own fears. The cabin felt hollow without Elijah's quiet presence. His empty chair at supper cast a shadow longer than the flickering lamplight. None of them could eat more than a few bites of bread. "They can't just take him," Clara said finally, her voice rough. "There must be something we can do." "The law's turned against us," Ruth replied bitterly. "Just like back in Virginia during the war. Men with money make their own justice." Naomi hadn't spoken since they came inside. Now she rose and went to the shelf where Elijah kept his father's Bible. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling. She brought it to the table, opening it with trembling fingers. "He reads from this every night," she said softly. "Says it gives him strength." She traced the faded words with her fingertip. "We need that strength now." Outside, wind stirred the ashes of their corral. The surviving sheep huddled together in what remained of their pen, their soft bleating carrying on the night air. Inside, 3 women drew closer together around the old Bible. "God is our refuge and strength," Ruth began quoting from memory, "a very present help in trouble." Clara's hand found Naomi's, squeezing gently. "We'll not leave him alone in this," she promised. "Whatever comes." The hours crept by like wounded things. None of them could sleep. They kept. The lamp burning, its light a tiny defiance against the dark. Naomi held the Bible in her lap, whispering prayers until her voice grew hoarse. Sometimes they would speak of small plans. Who would tend the sheep tomorrow? How to get word to Pastor Amos? What little money they had between them. But always their thoughts returned to Elijah, alone in a jail cell, and their own precarious situation. As false dawn began to pale the eastern sky, Naomi's prayers continued, a steady stream of hope against hope. "Lord, protect him. Lord, bring him home. Lord, show us the way through this valley." Morning light crept across the cabin floor, finding 3 exhausted women who had barely slept. Ruth stood first, her joints creaking as she moved to stoke the dying fire. The empty chair at the table seemed to mock their helplessness, but determination had settled in her bones during the long night. "I know where we might find help," she announced, pouring coffee into tin cups. "Elijah once told me his father traded with Apache folk up in Bear Creek Valley. They've been here longer than any of us. They'll remember who first claimed that spring." Clara looked up sharply. "You mean to ride up there alone?" "I must." Ruth's voice was firm. They knew old man Harper. Maybe they'll speak for his son. While Clara argued the dangers, Naomi pulled herself from her prayer vigil. "I'll stay and watch the cabin," she offered quietly. "Someone needs to tend what's left of the flock." Ruth nodded, already pulling on her heavy coat. "Clara, you know most folks in town. Talk to the women, miners' wives, farmers' daughters. The railroad's been stealing land all along the valley. We can't be the only ones hurting." Clara's weathered face hardened with purpose. "Reckon you're right about that. Sarah Miller lost her vegetable plot last spring. The McCready girls had their creek dammed up." She tied her shawl with determined fingers. "Time we started sharing those stories." Within the hour, Ruth had saddled Elijah's steadiest horse. She packed light, just water, dried beef, and her small medical kit. As the sun climbed higher, she pointed the horse north toward Bear Creek Valley. The trail grew steep and narrow, winding through stands of pine and across tumbled rock faces. Ruth's hands were steady on the reins, but her heart hammered. She'd treated Apache children for fever before, even delivered a baby once, but she'd never sought them out like this. Near midday, smoke from cooking fires led her to a small camp tucked against the valley wall. Women looked up from their work as she approached, children darting behind their skirts. Ruth dismounted slowly, holding up empty hands. "I come seeking help," she called out clearly. "I knew Thomas Harper, who traded here. His son Elijah needs witnesses to speak truth about his land." An elderly man emerged from a shelter, his face deeply lined. He studied Ruth for a long moment before speaking in careful English. "Thomas Harper, honest man, respected water rights, his boy same way?" "Yes," Ruth answered. "But the railroad claims his spring now. They've taken him to jail on false charges." The old man spat in disgust. "Iron horse people, they take much, give little, break many promises." He gestured for Ruth to sit. "Tell more." As shadows lengthened across the valley, Ruth shared their story. The old man nodded gravely, then spoke rapidly in Apache to the gathered people. Several elders added their voices, pointing toward the southern valleys. "We remember," the old man said finally. "That spring, Harper land 20 summers now, before railroad, before town. We will speak this truth." Relief flooded through Ruth's tired body. "Thank you," she whispered. "When can you come?" 2 days. Prepare words for white man's law." Meanwhile, Clara had ridden into Pine Hollow, her head high despite the whispers that followed her. She tied her horse outside the mercantile and waited patiently. One by one, women began to gather, drawn by curiosity or concern. "My Jesse lost his grazing rights last year," Sarah Miller confided, checking to ensure no railroad men were near. They said the paper was no good anymore. Same with our Northfield, added Mary Thompson. Said the survey changed, had to sell off half our cattle. Clara listened, encouraging each woman to share her story. By afternoon, a dozen had spoken of lost land, blocked streams, broken promises. They met in the church basement, sharing coffee and fresh bread, their voices growing stronger together. We all know someone who's suffered, Clara declared. Time we stopped hiding these stories. Time we stood together. Back at the cabin, Naomi moved through the quiet rooms like a ghost. She fed the remaining sheep, gathered eggs, swept floors, anything to keep her hands busy while her mind worried over Elijah in that jail cell. Near sunset, something drew her to his father's old trunk in the corner. She'd seen him take out the Bible from it, but had never looked deeper. Now, guided by some instinct, she lifted the heavy lid. The trunk smelled of leather and pine. Carefully, she sorted through clothes, tools, and letters. Near the bottom, her fingers touched cracked leather. A document case, its surface worn smooth by handling. Naomi pulled it out with trembling hands. Inside, yellowed papers crackled as she unfolded them. Her eyes widened as she read by the fading light. "Clara, Ruth," she called out as they returned at dusk. "Look what I've found." They gathered around the table as she spread out the documents. Ruth held the lamp closer while Clara squinted at the formal writing. "It's a treaty," Naomi explained, her voice shaking with excitement. "Signed 15 years ago between the territory governor and small settlers. It specifically protects their rights to springs and water sources." Her finger traced a crucial line. "Any claim filed before 1865 cannot be transferred without the owner's consent." "And the Harper claim was filed in 63, Clara breathed. "It's here in black and white." Ruth's hand closed over Naomi's. "The Lord surely led you to find these papers. Together with the Apache witnesses. We can prove Elijah's right to the land," Naomi finished. "We can bring him home." The lamp flame danced as the three women bent their heads together, hope burning bright in their hearts. Outside, a cool evening wind swept down from the mountains, carrying away the last traces of smoke from the burned corral. Tomorrow would bring new battles, but tonight they had found their weapons. Truth, unity, and justice long forgotten, but finally unearthed. Clara squared her shoulders. "First light tomorrow. We take these papers to Judge Wilson. He's stern but fair. He'll have to listen." "And I'll bring word to the Apache elders," Ruth added. "Their testimony strengthens our case." Naomi clutched the precious documents to her chest. "We'll free him," she whispered. "We have to." United in purpose, the three women settled in to plan their next moves. The cabin didn't feel quite so empty anymore. It was filled with determination and newfound hope. The Pine Hollow jail smelled of musty straw and despair. Elijah sat on the thin cot, his large frame hunched in prayer. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the barred window, casting shadows across the rough planks of the floor. His lips moved silently, forming words of hope, even as doubt gnawed at his heart. "Look what we caught ourselves. The virgin hermit!" A deputy's mocking voice rang out. "Bet those widows are crying their eyes out for you now." Elijah kept his head bowed, but his hands tightened into fists. The deputy's boots scraped against the wooden floor as he paced. "Railroad's gonna take that spring, boy. Ain't nothing you can do about it. Should have stayed up in your mountains where you belong." The sound of the church bell drifted through the window, and footsteps approached down the corridor. Pastor Amos appeared at the cell door, his kind face creased with concern. "Brother Elijah," the pastor said softly, "may I come in?" The deputy snorted but unlocked the door. Pastor Amos stepped inside, settling onto the cot beside Elijah. He waited until the deputy's footsteps faded before speaking. "The widows are fighting for you," he said, placing a weathered hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Ruth rode out at dawn to seek help. Clara's rallying support in town, even young Naomi. She's searching through your father's papers for anything that might help." Elijah lifted his head. Hope. flickering in his eyes. "They shouldn't risk themselves for me." "They risk themselves because you risked everything for them," Pastor Amos replied. "That's what family does." "Family," Elijah whispered, tasting the word. "I never thought I'd have one again after Pa died." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Pastor Amos smiled. "He brought 4 lonely souls together and made them strong. Don't lose faith now." Outside the jail, the town bustled with activity. Ruth's horse kicked up dust as she rode in from Bear Creek Valley, 3 Apache elders following on paint ponies. Townsfolk stopped to stare as they passed, but Ruth held her head high. She helped the elders dismount near the church where Pastor Amos met them. The oldest, Grey Wolf, spoke in careful English. "We remember Thomas Harper," he said. "Remember when spring became his, before Iron Horse came, before town grew. We will speak this truth to your lawmen." Ruth clasped his hand gratefully. "Thank you. Your words carry weight of years. They must listen." Across town, Clara moved from house to house, speaking quietly with the women. In kitchens and on back porches, she gathered their stories of railroad bullying. Sarah Miller described losing her vegetable plot. The Thompson sisters told of their creek being dammed without warning. Each woman added her name to a petition demanding fair treatment. "My John would have stood with Elijah," Martha Weber said as she signed. "Railroad can't keep taking whatever they want." By late afternoon, Clara had 30 signatures. She folded the paper carefully, tucking it into her shawl. The sun was setting as she made her way to the church. Naomi had spent hours at Elijah's table, copying out relevant sections of the treaty papers onto clean sheets. Her handwriting flowed neat and clear, each word carefully formed. She wrapped the original documents in oilcloth, protecting them from damage. When darkness fell, the 3 widows slipped through Pine Hollow's quiet streets. They met in the empty church, where a single lamp burned on the altar. Pastor Amos stood watch at the door while they laid out their evidence. "The Apache elders will testify tomorrow," Ruth reported, spreading a rough map on the altar. "They've marked where the spring has been since before the territory was formed." Clara added her petition. "These signatures show we're not alone. Other families have suffered from railroad greed." Naomi's hands trembled as she unwrapped the treaty papers. "And these prove Elijah's legal right to the spring. His father's claim predates any railroad survey by years." The lamplight caught the gold cross above the altar as the women joined hands in a circle. Their shadows stretched long against the wooden walls. "We risk everything," Ruth said softly. "The railroad men won't take kindly to being challenged." "I'd rather risk everything than live cowering," Clara replied, her voice firm. "Elijah took us in when no one else would," Naomi added. "Now we stand for him." Pastor Amos stepped forward, placing his hands over their joined ones. "The Lord stands with those who seek justice. Let us pray for strength." Their heads bowed as his voice rose in prayer. Outside, a cool wind stirred the trees. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, but tonight they stood united in faith and purpose. "Remember," Ruth said as they prepared to leave, "we must be in court early. The Apache elders will meet us at sunrise." Clara nodded, tucking the petition securely away. "I'll bring the townswomen. Let them see they're not alone in standing up." "I'll have the treaty papers ready," Naomi promised, carefully rewrapping them. They slipped out into the night one by one, carrying their precious evidence. The church bell tolled 9 times, its deep notes rolling across the sleeping town. In his cell, Elijah heard it and smiled faintly, feeling their presence even through stone walls. The widows had come far from that first desperate day when they'd approached him on the street. Now they moved with purpose, armed with truth and united in determination. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they would face it together. Pastor Amos watched them go, his heart full of pride. These women, once broken by loss, had found strength in each other. They were ready to challenge injustice, not just for Elijah, but for all who had suffered silently. The lamp on the altar flickered as he prepared to lock the church doors. Tomorrow would test their courage, but tonight they had laid their cause before God. Justice, long delayed, was stirring in Pine Hollow. Morning light streamed through Pine Hollow's town hall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The makeshift courtroom buzzed with whispers as townsfolk filed in, filling every available bench. At the front, 3 railroad lawyers in expensive suits arranged papers on their table, occasionally sharing smirks. Judge Wilson, a stern-faced man with silver hair, settled behind his raised desk. He adjusted his spectacles and banged his gavel 3 times. "Court is now in session," he announced. "Railroad Company versus Elijah Harper, regarding water rights and trespassing charges." The main railroad lawyer, Mr. Fletcher, rose smoothly to his feet. His polished boots gleamed as he approached the bench. "Your Honor, this case is quite simple," he said, holding up a stack of documents. "These deeds clearly show the railroad's claim to all water sources along the proposed line. Mr. Harper is occupying company property illegally." He laid the papers before the judge with a flourish. The other lawyers nodded in agreement, their faces smug. Sheriff Keene was called to testify first. He stood at attention, badge glinting. "Sheriff, please describe the accused's activities," Mr. Fletcher prompted. "Well, sir, Harper's been squatting on that spring for months now," Keene declared. "Taking in those widows, stirring up trouble. When we tried to serve notice, he refused to vacate." "And did he resist arrest?" "Not exactly, but—" The courthouse door creaked open. Ruth Dawson entered, her back straight as a ramrod, leading 3 elderly Apache men. Their dignified presence hushed the room. Behind them came Clara and Naomi, carrying folders and papers. "Your Honor," Ruth spoke clearly, "we have witnesses who can speak to the true history of this land." Judge Wilson peered over his glasses. "This is most irregular, madam." "So is imprisoning an innocent man," Clara said firmly. "We ask to present our evidence." The railroad lawyers jumped up to object, but something in Ruth's steady gaze made the judge pause. "I'll allow it," he said finally, "but maintain proper order." Ruth guided the eldest Apache man, Gray Wolf, to the witness stand. His weathered face held years of wisdom. "Please tell us what you know of the spring in question," Ruth prompted gently. Gray Wolf spoke in measured tones. "For 3 generations, my people traded at that spring. When Thomas Harper came, he traded fairly. His son Elijah does the same. The water has always been free for those who respect it." The second elder nodded. "Before Iron Horse, before town, spring belonged to all who lived in peace. Harper family honored this way." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The railroad lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Clara stepped forward next, unfolding her petition. "Your Honor, I have signatures from 30 townsfolk, mothers, wives, and daughters, all testifying to the railroad's pattern of seizing land without just cause." She read several accounts aloud. Wells blocked, gardens destroyed, families displaced. With each story, more heads nodded in the crowd. "We're not just speaking for Elijah Harper," Clara declared. "We're speaking for everyone who's lost to railroad greed." The door opened again. 2 deputies led Elijah in, his wrists shackled. He looked thin but stood tall, drawing strength from the widow's presence. Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but she squared her shoulders and approached the bench. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger, "I have documents that prove Elijah's legal right to the spring." She carefully unfolded the yellowed treaty papers. "These show Thomas Harper's original claim, registered 15 years ago. The spring was specifically included, with rights protected under territorial law." Judge Wilson took the papers, examining them closely. Mr. Fletcher's face had grown red. "These could be forgeries," he blustered. "That woman has no standing." "I can verify their authenticity," a new voice called. The county clerk stood up from the crowd. "Those papers bear my predecessor's seal. They're genuine." The whispers grew louder. Townsfolk who had come expecting entertainment were now leaning forward, faces serious. Several women nodded firmly at Clara's petition. A rancher in the back called out, "My father traded with Thomas Harper at that spring." Judge Wilson banged his gavel for order. The railroad lawyers huddled together, whispering urgently. Elijah stood straighter, looking at each of the widows in turn. Ruth's quiet strength, Clara's fierce determination, Naomi's gentle courage. They had become more than survivors seeking shelter. They were his family, fighting for their home. The Apache elders remained seated with dignity, their presence a testament to years of history no paper deed could erase. Grey Wolf caught Elijah's eye and nodded slightly, acknowledging the bond between their peoples. Through the windows, morning had brightened to full day. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams, and somewhere a meadowlark sang. The courtroom waited as Judge Wilson reviewed the documents, the only sound the rustle of paper and the creak of wooden benches. Mr. Fletcher tried one last argument. "Your Honor, the railroad's development is vital to this territory's future. We cannot let sentiment interfere with progress." "Is it progress to break faith with honest folk?" Ruth asked quietly. "To destroy the very community you claim to serve?" Her words hung in the air, and more than one person in the crowd nodded. The railroad lawyers' smirks had vanished, replaced by worried frowns as they watched support shifting away from them. Elijah's chains clinked softly as he turned to face the judge. Though he had not spoken, his presence embodied everything at stake, not just a spring, but the right of common people to stand against powerful interests. The widows gathered near him, a living testimony to the strength of chosen family and shared purpose. The morning sun climbed higher, and Pine Hollow's town hall held its breath, waiting for justice to speak. Judge Wilson's fingers drummed against his desk as he studied the documents before him. His weathered face betrayed unusual uncertainty. Everyone knew the judge typically sided with money and progress, yet something in the evidence presented gave him pause. The railroad lawyers huddled near their table, papers rustling as they whispered urgently. Mr. Fletcher straightened his vest and approached the bench once more. "Your Honor, regardless of these questionable treaties, the railroad's claim supersedes all prior arrangements," he insisted, voice sharp with frustration. "The very future of this territory depends on our line's completion. Surely you won't let one spring and a band of unfortunate widows stand in the way of progress?" A low murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Clara's spine stiffened at the slight, but she held her peace, her hand finding Naomi's trembling fingers. The sound of a wooden bench scraping against the floor drew all eyes to Pastor Amos Whitfield as he rose slowly to his feet. The circuit preacher's plain black coat was dusty from his morning ride, but his presence commanded attention. "Your Honor," Pastor Amos began, his gentle voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "If I may speak?" Judge Wilson nodded, perhaps grateful for the interruption. "We gather here today not just to consider property rights, but to weigh matters of conscience and community," the pastor continued. "Scripture tells us that God's law demands justice for the widow and protection for the vulnerable. These women before you, Ruth, Clara, and Naomi, sought shelter with young Elijah Harper not out of impropriety, but out of desperate need." He gestured to the Apache elders. "These respected witnesses have testified to years of peaceful cooperation at that spring. The treaty papers prove what honor and handshakes once established. Are we to cast aside such bonds of trust in favor of mere profit?" Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the silver in Pastor Amos's hair as he spoke. "Your Honor, there is a higher law than railroad deeds. It commands us to deal justly with our neighbors and protect the weak from the strong. I pray you'll consider not just what is legally expedient, but what is right in the eyes of God and community." The railroad lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Several townsfolk nodded in agreement with the pastor's words. Ruth's eyes shone with unshed tears as she watched Judge Wilson's face. For long moments, only the tick of the wall clock broke the silence. The judge removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I have reviewed the evidence presented today with great care," he began. "The railroad's claim rests on recent paper deeds and promises of progress. Mr. Harper's claim is supported by treaty rights, community testimony, and years of peaceful use." He replaced his spectacles, looking directly at the railroad lawyers. "While I appreciate the importance of development, it cannot come at the cost of breaking faith with honest settlers. The treaty papers presented by Mrs. Naomi Carter are genuine and binding. They clearly establish the spring as part of the Harper homestead with protected water rights." A collective intake of breath filled the room. Judge Wilson's gavel struck once, sharp and decisive. "I therefore rule that the spring remains the rightful property of Elijah Harper under treaty protection. All charges of trespassing and fraud are hereby dismissed." The sound of the gavel striking again was nearly lost. In the gasps and exclamations that erupted, the railroad lawyers' faces darkened with anger as they gathered their papers. "Deputies," the judge called, "remove Mr. Harper's restraints." The chains fell away with a clank. For a moment, Elijah stood still, hardly daring to believe. Then Ruth reached him first, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce embrace. Clara and Naomi rushed forward to join them, their joyful tears falling freely now. "Thank you," Elijah whispered hoarsely, holding them close. "Thank you for fighting for me." "We're family now," Clara said firmly. "It's what family does." The Apache elders approached, offering dignified nods of approval. Grey Wolf clasped Elijah's hand. "Your father would be proud," he said simply. "You have honored his way." Pastor Amos beamed as he joined them. "God's justice prevails," he said warmly, though it often takes courage to see it done. They made their way outside into the bright afternoon sun. A crowd had gathered on the street, drawn by news of the verdict. The railroad men pushed through roughly, faces dark with thwarted plans. Mr. Fletcher paused to level one last glare at Elijah and the widows before stalking away toward the hotel. But their departure was hardly noticed. Townspeople pressed forward to offer congratulations. Women who had signed Clara's petition smiled and nodded. Several ranchers clapped Elijah on the shoulder. Children darted around their legs, caught up in the celebration. "Well done, boy," the county clerk said gruffly. "Your father's spring is safe now." Ruth squeezed Elijah's arm. "Let's go home," she said softly. Elijah looked at the three women who had fought so hard for him, Ruth's quiet strength, Clara's fierce determination, Naomi's gentle faith. Home wasn't just the cabin anymore. It was wherever they were together. A cheer went up from the crowd as they mounted their horses. Even the afternoon sun seemed to shine more brightly as they rode out of Pine Hollow, leaving the railroad's threats behind. They had faced the powerful and prevailed, not through force, but through truth and unity. The hoofbeats of their horses kicked up little clouds of dust as they headed toward the hills and their waiting cabin. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark's song carried on the breeze, a song of victory, of justice, and a family forged in faith and courage. Twilight painted the western sky in deep purples and golds as Elijah and the widows approached their cabin. The sight that greeted them made them pause their horses in surprise. At least a dozen wagons and riders were gathered around their home, and warm lamplight spilled from every window. The aroma of fresh-baked pies wafted through the crisp evening air. "Land sakes," Clara whispered, her usual sharp tone softened with wonder. As they drew closer, familiar faces emerged. From the crowd, Mrs. Peterson from the Mercantile, the widow Jenkins and her daughters, even crusty old Tom Wheeler and his wife had made the journey up from their ranch in the valley. Elijah dismounted first, helping Naomi down from her horse, while Ruth and Clara swung easily from their saddles. The gathered neighbors surged forward, arms laden with quilts, baskets, and warm wishes. "We brought some supper," Mrs. Peterson announced, holding out a steaming chicken pie. "Figured you all might be too tired to cook after such a day." "And these blankets," added Mrs. Wheeler, presenting a stack of carefully folded quilts. "Winter's coming, and that old cabin gets mighty drafty." One by one, the neighbors stepped forward. Each offering came with quiet words of apology and support. "We should have stood with you sooner," Tom Wheeler admitted gruffly, tugging at his beard. "Weren't right, how folks talked." "The railroad men had half the town fooled," his wife added, "but you showed us what real courage looks like." Inside the cabin, the transformation was even more striking. Women had swept and straightened while they were gone. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, a gift from the seamstress in town. The hearth blazed welcomingly, and every surface held some offering of food or comfort. Naomi's eyes filled with tears at the sight. "It's like Christmas," she breathed. Ruth squeezed her shoulder. "It's like family," she corrected gently. They all crowded inside, filling the small space with warmth and chatter. Clara organized the food on the rough-hewn table while Ruth directed traffic and made sure everyone had a place to sit or stand. Naomi found cups and plates, her movements more graceful than they'd been in months. Elijah stood near the hearth, still somewhat overwhelmed by the crowd. But the terror of public speaking that had gripped him in town was replaced by a quieter sort of wonder. These were his neighbors now. Their neighbors. The lonely isolation he'd known for so long was truly over. Mrs. Peterson pressed a cup of hot cider into his hands. "You've done your father proud, young man," she said softly. "Building something fine here, you are." He sipped the cider, letting its warmth spread through him as he watched the scene before him. The cabin that had seemed so empty just weeks ago now overflowed with life and fellowship. Children darted between adults' legs, sneaking cookies when they thought no one was looking. The air was rich with the scent of pie and coffee and wood smoke. As the evening deepened, folks began to settle. Some sat on chairs or floor, others leaned against walls, all drawn toward the hearth's warmth. Elijah cleared his throat, knowing he needed to speak. I want to thank you all," he began hesitantly. "Not just for coming tonight, but for standing with us today." He looked at the three women who had changed his life so completely. "Especially these ladies, who fought for our home when I couldn't." "Now, Elijah," Ruth interrupted firmly, "you fought plenty, just in your own quiet way." He shook his head. "I always thought I was too weak to be what others needed. Pa died when I was young, and I grew up thinking strength meant being loud and sure, like those railroad men." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "But you three showed me different. You taught me that real strength is in having faith, in God, in each other, in what's right." Clara's usual sharp expression softened. "Wasn't sons we needed," she said, echoing Ruth's earlier words in town. "It was faith, and you gave us that, Elijah Harper. Gave us a home and hope when we had neither." Naomi, who had been quiet until now, began to sing softly. Her clear voice lifted in an old hymn about grace and guidance. One by one, others joined in, until the cabin rang with harmony. The children's sweet voices twined with deeper adult tones, creating something beautiful and unexpected. When the song ended, Clara rose to pour more cider for everyone. The conversation turned to practical matters: winter preparations, repair work needed on the cabin, plans for expanding the garden come spring. But underneath ran a current of deeper understanding. They were no longer just neighbors helping neighbors. They were a community, bound together by choice and circumstance and faith. As the evening wore on, folks began to take their leave. Each departure brought more promises of future help and visits. The children were sleepy, the pies mostly eaten, the first chill of night seeping in around the window frames. Finally, only Elijah and his unusual family remained. They stood together in the doorway, watching the last wagon disappear down the trail. Stars were beginning to pepper the darkening sky, and a lone coyote called from the distant hills. "Reckon we should clean up," Clara said practically, though she made no immediate move to do so. "In a minute," Ruth replied, her voice peaceful. "Let's just be grateful a moment longer." Naomi leaned her head against Elijah's shoulder, humming softly. The tune was different now. Not a hymn, but a lullaby she must have once sung to her lost child. But the grief in her voice was gentler than before, tempered by new hope. They stood there together, watching night settle over their land. The spring that had caused so much trouble burbled softly in the darkness. Wind whispered through the pines. All around them, their small piece of earth held the promise of tomorrow. Inside, the fire crackled and warm lamplight spilled out into the yard. The cabin wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a home, made so by faith and courage and the mysterious ways God bound unlikely people into family. Elijah felt the last of his doubt fall away. He wasn't the strong protector he'd thought these women needed. Instead, they had all protected each other, each bringing their own kind of strength to weave something stronger than any one of them could be alone. "Thank you," he said again, his voice rough with emotion, "for believing in me, for fighting for our home, for everything." The women's hands found his in the darkness, their grip firm and sure. No more words were needed. The night settled around them like a blessing, full of gratitude and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. Winter descended on the mountain with silent grace. The first snowflakes drifted down one crisp morning while Elijah checked the sheep pen. He paused, watching the white specks settle on his sleeve, remembering winters spent alone in this same spot. But now, smoke curled steadily from the cabin chimney, and through the window he could see Clara teaching young Tommy Peterson to card wool. The boy's parents had fallen ill 2 weeks past, and Ruth had insisted they take him in until they recovered. "The good Lord gives us chances to share our blessings," she'd said firmly, and that was that. Tommy wasn't the only child who'd found shelter under their roof as winter approached. Sarah Wheeler spent her days there too, while her widowed father worked long hours at the mill. Inside, the cabin had transformed. What was once a sparse bachelor's shelter now hummed with life. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, their subtle fragrance mixing with wood smoke and fresh bread. Quilts draped every available surface, and children's drawings decorated the walls. Even the rough-hewn table had been softened by a checkered cloth, though it still bore the marks of Elijah's father's knife. "Storm's coming," Elijah announced as he stamped snow from his boots. "Best get more wood in." Clara nodded, her hands never stopping their patient demonstration. "Tommy, show me again how to pull the fibers straight." The boy's tongue poked out in concentration as he worked the cards. At 10 years old, he was eager to prove himself useful, though his movements were still clumsy. Clara watched with the same steadiness she showed the sheep, neither praising nor criticizing, just present and attentive. Ruth looked up from where she sat by the fire, teaching Sarah to read from the Bible. "Naomi took the little ones gathering pine nuts this morning. Should we send word?" "I'll fetch them," Elijah offered, but before he could reach for his coat, the door burst open in a swirl of snowflakes. Naomi herded in 3 small children, their cheeks pink with cold and excitement. 6-year-old Mary Collins clutched a basket of pine nuts, while the Cooper twins, barely 4, bounced with endless energy. Behind them came 2 Rivers, their Apache friend, carrying a heavy bundle wrapped in deerskin. "Perfect timing," Naomi laughed, helping the children out of their wraps. "We saw the clouds building and hurried back. 2 Rivers insisted on escorting us." The Apache man nodded gravely, though his eyes crinkled with warmth. He'd been a friend to Elijah's father, and that friendship had deepened since the court battle. Now he regularly brought gifts of smoked meat and healing herbs, teaching the children Apache words and stories when he visited. "Storm medicine," he said, unwrapping his bundle to reveal dried meat and herbs. "For strong winter." Ruth rose to accept the gifts with appropriate ceremony. "We are grateful, friend. Will you stay and share our meal?" He would, and soon the cabin filled with savory stews, smells as Clara and Naomi prepared dinner. The children gathered around 2 rivers by the fire, entranced as he showed them how to weave small baskets from pine needles. Their laughter mingled with the crack and pop of burning wood. Elijah watched from his corner, mending a harness. These moments still amazed him, the easy flow of conversation, the children's unguarded joy, the way his once silent home now felt like the heart of their small community. Even the Apache man seemed to have found a place here, bridging cultures with gentle patience. The afternoon passed in peaceful industry. Ruth taught the older children scripture between their chores, her clear voice carrying the ancient words with conviction. Clara demonstrated practical skills, how to card wool, mend clothes, check for rot in stored vegetables. Naomi led the little ones in songs as they worked, her sweet voice making even simple tasks feel special. When the light began to fade, 2 rivers rose to leave despite the thickening snow. "More storms coming," he warned. "Big winter, but your house is strong now." He touched his chest. "Here is strong." They all understood his meaning. The cabin's walls had been reinforced, the roof repaired, the pantry well stocked. But the real strength lay in the family they'd built, in the community that now gathered here. As evening settled in, more neighbors arrived, seeking shelter from the storm. The Wheelers came first, then the Petersons, recovered enough to collect Tommy, but staying for warmth and company. The cabin stretched to hold them all, space found on floor and benches, children dozing in corners while adults talked quietly. Elijah moved among them, offering coffee and comfort with growing ease. He no longer stumbled over words or shrank from attention. The shy mountain man remained, but he'd found his place as head of this unusual household. "You've done fine work here," Mr. Wheeler said, watching his daughter Sarah sleep peacefully beside the Cooper twins. "This place, it's become something special." "The Lord's work," Ruth interjected from nearby, but her proud smile was for Elijah. "Though it takes willing hands to do it." Later, after the neighbors had braved the snow home and the children were tucked into their makeshift beds, the 4 original members of the household sat by the dying fire. The wind howled outside, but inside was only peace. "I never thought—" Naomi began softly, then paused to gather her thoughts. "After losing my baby, I thought I'd never hear children's laughter again without pain. But now we have a house full," Clara finished, her usual brisk tone gentled. "Who'd have thought it that day we marched up to Elijah in town?" They all smiled at the memory. How far they'd come from that desperate gamble. 3 widows and a virgin mountain man trying to survive. Now their home provided shelter for more than just themselves. The fence lines were strong again, the sheep flock recovering. Food filled the pantry, and more importantly, love filled the rooms. "I reckon I ought to thank you," Elijah said slowly, watching the firelight play on the walls, "for choosing me that day, for teaching me what family really means." Ruth reached over to pat his hand. "The Lord chooses better than we know," she said. "Look at all he's built here. Apache and settler, widow and bachelor, orphan and elder, all under one roof in peace." The snow continued falling outside, but they barely heard it now. The cabin held them safe, a beacon of warmth in the winter night. Tomorrow would bring more work, more children to teach, more neighbors to help. But for now, they sat in comfortable silence, bound together by something stronger than blood or law. Naomi began to hum softly, not the sad lullaby of her lost child, but a hymn of thanksgiving. One by one they joined in, their voices blending in the darkness. The children stirred briefly at the sound, but didn't wake, secure in the knowledge that they were home. This was what they'd built together, not just a shelter from storms, but a place where wounds could heal, where differences faded before love, where even the deepest loneliness could find answer in fellowship. The cabin had become more than any of them had dreamed that first uncertain day. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping their mountain in pristine white. But inside, the warmth of found family kept winter's chill at bay. Their home stood as testament to the truth that family could be chosen, that love could bridge any gap, that God's greatest gifts often came in unexpected forms. Elijah looked around at his family, Ruth's quiet strength, Clara's fierce loyalty, Naomi's gentle heart, the children's innocent trust, and felt profound gratitude. He no longer blushed to claim them as his own. They had shaped him as much as he had sheltered them, teaching him that true strength lay not in standing alone, but in standing together. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across fresh-fallen snow as neighbors made their way through drifts toward the Harper cabin. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies in the gathering dusk, lighting the path that had been tramped down by many boots throughout the day. Smoke curled from the chimney into the crystal-clear December air, and warm light spilled from the windows, beckoning visitors inside. Ruth stood at the door, welcoming each arrival with dignified grace. Her gray-streaked hair was neatly pinned, and she wore her best dark dress, brightened by a red shawl Clara had insisted she wear for the occasion. "Welcome, welcome," she called, as the Peterson family trudged up, their arms full of blankets and food for sharing. Inside, Naomi arranged benches and chairs borrowed from neighbors, transforming the main room into an informal chapel. Her sweet voice hummed carols as she worked, and the sound wrapped around the busy space like a gentle embrace. The cabin had never looked more inviting. Evergreen boughs decorated the walls, their fresh scent mixing with the aroma of spiced cider warming on the stove. Clara directed traffic in the kitchen area, organizing the parade of dishes arriving with each new guest. "Pies on the sideboard," she instructed Mrs. Wheeler, who had brought 3. "Mind you don't set them too close to the fire." Her usual sharp tone was softened by the spirit of the evening, though she still maintained strict order among the chaos. Elijah moved between groups of guests, less awkward now than he would have been months ago. Though he still blushed when directly addressed, he had grown into his role as head of this unusual household. He helped elderly visitors to comfortable seats near the fire, and made sure children had places where they could see and hear. As twilight deepened outside, the cabin filled with the murmur of friendly voices. The Apache traders who had become such steadfast friends sat near the fire, wrapped in bright blankets. Grey Wolf's daughter had brought traditional sweet bread, which sat proudly among the pies and cakes on Clara's carefully arranged table. Pastor Amos arrived last, stamping snow from his boots and beaming at the gathered crowd. "Brings joy to my heart," he said, clasping Elijah's hand, "to see such fellowship under this roof." The children grew restless with excitement until Naomi began the first hymn. Her clear voice rose above the general noise, and gradually the room quieted. "Silent night," she announced, and one by one other voices joined hers. Ruth's steady alto provided foundation. Clara, though she claimed not to be musical, added her warm tenor. Even Elijah, who once would have remained silent, lifted his voice in harmony. The sound swelled, filling every corner of the cabin with praise. They moved through familiar carols. "O come all ye faithful, angels we have heard on high, joy to the world." The Apache visitors listened respectfully, then offered their own winter blessing song, its unfamiliar melody hauntingly beautiful in the lantern-lit room. Between songs, neighbors shared stories and laughter. The Wheeler twins told the tale of their father getting lost in the snow last winter, only to be guided home by the light from this very cabin. Mrs. Peterson spoke of how Clara had helped deliver her youngest during a spring storm. Each story wove another thread in the tapestry of community that had grown around this once lonely homestead. As evening wore on, younger children began to drift toward sleep. They curled up like kittens on quilts near the hearth, their faces peaceful in the firelight. Sarah Wheeler's head drooped against her brother James's shoulder as they listened to the grown-ups sing. The Collins boys, usually full of endless energy, sat quietly, eyes heavy with contentment. Pastor Amos stood to read the Christmas story from his well-worn Bible. His voice carried clearly as he spoke of shepherds and angels, of a humble birth and a divine promise. The words seemed especially fitting in this place where unlikely grace had bloomed in barren soil. "And the glory of the Lord shone round about them," he read, while firelight flickered on the walls. "And they were sore afraid. And the angel said unto them, Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people." More carols followed, softer now as the night deepened. Naomi led, "What child is this?" while Ruth rocked a sleeping child in her arms, her face serene. Clara passed cups of cider, moving quietly so as not to disturb the drowsy little ones. Eventually, parents began gathering their sleeping children. Goodbyes were exchanged, along with promises to return for New Year's celebrations. Blankets were wrapped around small bodies, and drowsy thank yous were mumbled as families made their way out into the snowy night. Grey Wolf and his people departed with dignified nods and warm handclasps. "Good Christmas to you," he said carefully in English. "Many blessings on this house." Pastor Amos was the last to leave, pausing at the door to embrace each of them. "The Lord's hand is surely on this place," he said, his eyes bright with joyful tears. "What seemed impossible has become a miracle of love." When the door finally closed behind him, the household stood in comfortable silence. The fire crackled softly, and outside snow began to fall again, big flakes drifting past the windows like feathers. Elijah moved to bank the fire for the night while the women straightened the room, working together with the ease of long practice. When the last cup was washed and the leftover food stored away, they gathered naturally around the hearth, as they had so many evenings before. Ruth settled into her favorite chair, her Bible in her lap. Clara leaned against the mantel, her usual stern expression softened by the evening's joy. Naomi curled up on the floor near Ruth's feet, her face glowing in the firelight. Elijah looked at each of them in turn, these three women who had marched into his life with an outrageous proposal and changed everything. His throat tightened with emotion as he remembered that day in the county office, how lost and afraid they had all been. Slowly, he lowered himself to his knees. The women watched in surprised silence as he bowed his head. Then, for the first time since they had known him, Elijah began to pray aloud. "Lord," he said, his voice steady and clear, "you've given me more than sons. You've given me a family." The words hung in the quiet room. Ruth's breath caught audibly, and Naomi's eyes filled with tears. Clara's hand pressed against her mouth, holding back a sob. "Thank you," Elijah continued, "for sending these good women to my door. Thank you for their strength and wisdom. Thank you for children's laughter in this house, for neighbors' kindness, for your protection through our trials." Tears slid down Naomi's cheeks as she reached for Ruth's hand. Clara moved closer, placing her hand on Elijah's shoulder. They remained that way, connected in body and spirit, as his prayer continued. "Thank you for justice winning over greed, for faith defeating fear. Thank you for making us stronger together than we ever were alone. Amen." "Amen," the women echoed softly. No one moved for several moments. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, snow continued to fall, wrapping their world in hushed white, sealing their triumph with a blanket of peace. Finally, Ruth opened her Bible, finding a familiar passage. "The Lord bless you and keep you," she read, her voice thick with emotion. "The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." "Peace," Naomi whispered, and in that word was everything they had fought for and won, not just survival, but belonging, not just shelter, but home, not just companions, but family. The lamplight glowed warm against the windows, a beacon in the winter night. Inside, 4 hearts beat in harmony, bound together by love stronger than blood. What had begun as desperate necessity had blossomed into something beautiful and lasting, proof that family could be found in the most unexpected places, that faith could build bridges across the deepest divides, that love could make a home even in the wildest corners of the frontier. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.